Well, welcome, Scott. I am so excited to have this conversation with you today and have you on my new podcast. We've had lots of great conversations, and I'm such a fan of you as a person and your work. So I'm just excited to dive in with you today.
Thanks, Katie. Samesies.
So a little bit about you before I let you dive in and share a little bit, but you're a professor of educational leadership at the University of Colorado, widely recognized as one of the nation's leading experts in P-12 school leadership, deeper learning, technology, and innovation. I love that. You're also the founding director of the UCEA Center for the Advanced Study of Technology, Leadership in Education, also known as CASEL. The only university center in the US dedicated to technology needs of school administrators. We know how impactful experiences are in shaping that path. The way you've landed supporting leadership with technology in the university, it's a unique juncture. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences and how you ended up here?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I was teaching 8th grade history in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina. And my wife and I knew we wanted to come back and get our terminal degrees. And my master's had been in school leadership. And I had really loved my school law course. So somehow we ended up at the University of Iowa. Didn't know much about the Midwest. We were both East Coasters. And my graduate assistantship for the whole time I was there was that my professors in my department started bringing me these databases from the US Department of Education that for the first time ever were on CD-ROM.
Remember that?
And they were interested in sort of this large scale national data for research and policy analysis and so on. And that early work morphed into me running a computer lab for my department, where they would just buy software, ask me to learn it, and then teach other grad students and faculty. So basically had 5 years of 20 hours a week of just playing with tech. Awesome. And I wasn't super tech savvy before then, but was pretty tech savvy after that. Somewhere along that journey, I decided to try and become a professor rather than go back and being a school administrator like I thought I was going to. And actually started out as a school law prof for a couple of years because I loved the law, had the law degree and so on. But realized very quickly that my heart was with technology and that nobody was really looking at the intersection of technology plus leadership. So it's been a wild ride since about 2001, and it's sort of been a unique space for me to live in.
So many twists and turns. Well, for one, middle school teacher, that explains a lot. We are a very special species. And, you know, when you find a solid middle school teacher, it's hard not to connect. Right. So that definitely explains a lot. When I was getting my Ph.D. while I was teaching and while I was a coach. And so that's been kind of my affinity for connecting research to practice. But not unlike you, I thought I was going to go teach at the university. That was always what I thought my path was. I was going to teach new teachers. And, you know, just like you, things twist and turn. And I ended up working at a university, but supporting schools and districts. But it's been a fun journey. So because you ended up at the university, you are noted as one of the most visible professors. Your work is out there, your research is out there, and you've done a really, in my opinion, fabulous job of connecting the research to practice and helping school leaders and practitioners really understand what to do. So how did you decide, how did you end up there? Like, how did you decide to start sharing your work? How did you start blogging?
So actually got lucky, which is true for most of us, right?
Yes, exactly.
So my colleague, Joan Hughes, who's now a professor at UT Austin, she and I submitted a proposal for this enormous federal grant to create the first graduate program in the country that would prepare a tech-savvy school leader, because there weren't any.
And what year was this?
2003.
Okay.
We had a bunch of partners in that work, partners like ISTE and Microsoft and IBM and the George Lucas Educational Foundation. And so we had all these people who were like, yeah, we need leaders who understand this stuff. And so that we got funded, and that turned into this ginormous multi-year, $2.5 million project that ultimately led to the formation of Castle, right?
Okay.
As sort of the only center, university center, started at University of Minnesota. And then around 2006, when blogging sort of started to take off, I was like, well, this seems like a good way to get the word out about the work that we're doing. And also, the other thing that I was realizing is that as a professor who cared about technology plus leadership, there weren't really any people in academia who were doing that. There were like 2 others, and I knew them both. But there was plenty of great tech leaders out in the field, right, doing great work. So blogging for me became this space where I could interact with really smart people who were doing really great work, and build my network outside of higher ed, because there wasn't anybody in higher ed for me to really connect with other than these couple folks. And that turned out to be fantastic, right? And what I didn't realize, of course, as I started blogging was how much it would do for me as a reflection space, right? Because, you know, those first 6 months in particular, when you're blogging into the void and nobody's reading you and nobody's leaving you comments and nobody's interacting with you, but you're realizing that this is a great place to discover what your own voice is, right? And my voice, my authentic voice, is very different from an academic journal writing voice, which is very stilted and formal and boring and whatever, right?
Yes.
So the blog became this sort of self-feeding cycle where I was just putting random thoughts out there just to get them out of my head and to capture them for later. And then people were either finding value in them, or they were giving me great feedback on those thoughts, like, Scott, that's a stupid idea. Here's how you should think about that instead, or whatever, right? And then Carl Fish came along with the Did You Know Shift Happens videos. And my remade version of that was the one that went really viral. And after that, it was just, you know, full pedal to the floor. And, you know, it's been like I said before, it's been kind of this crazy ride ever since, as a sort of trying to leverage the blog as a space to spark conversations, bring people's attention to certain issues, provide resources, and so on.
Yeah, and it's so helpful. I love it. That's how I first, of course, found you. I was at the University of San Diego and I was researching. So, you know, I was still in this space when I went to the university. After I finished my PhD, you know, my dissertation, I have like 300 pages of very boring, stilted language, right? Like no examples, no stories, just straight research evidence. And I was like a lot of sticky notes all over my, you know, all over my desk. I had like Microsoft Word documents left and right that were like, you know, categorized on my computer, but none of it was outside of my computer or outside my head. And I just kept tweaking the words and like, I'm going to make this perfect article that's going to go in this journal that like no one's ever going to see or is going to be translated to practice. And so it started when I started blogging, and this is George Couros came to like speak at the university. He was like, why are you not sharing? I'm like, what do you mean? Like, I don't understand.
Right.
And I had the same experience as you, that I started finding my voice and figuring out, and it became this opportunity for me to reflect. Not necessarily, I wasn't thinking about like, oh, I'm going to teach everyone else, but I started really getting concrete in what I was thinking and being able to have a much more conversational voice. I look back at my early blogs like 8 years ago, and it's like, research says this, do this, like, great, right? And like, no surprise, not many people were reading and, you know, connecting with those. But that's how I was saying, is like, that's how I found you, going back, seeing your research, learning about the 4 shifts protocol at this time. This was like 2013, I think. And a lot of superintendents were like, we just went one-to-one. Right. Everyone has a Chromebook. Everyone has an iPad. We're transforming education, right? And I'm like, well, maybe. What does learning look like? What are you trying to accomplish? And so your 4 shifts protocol was super informative and really helped us think about it. So will you talk a little bit about where that came from and how it's been used in schools all around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Katie. So at some point, I moved from University of Minnesota down to Iowa State University. I was running the school leadership program. Castle came with me. And we were having a conversation with the handful of school districts in Iowa at the time that were one-to-one. There were 6 of them. And they said, well, you know, we know of another 9 districts across the state that are going one-to-one. It would be fun if we all got together. And I was like, all right, well, Castle will bring you all together, right? Let's come meet up in Ames and have a chat. So we had a chat, and they were like, this is so helpful, you know, like principals talking to principals, superintendents talking to superintendents, coaches, tech directors, whatever said, like, we should do this more often. We're like, all right, here's the deal. Because we know there's another wave of school districts coming behind you, right? So Castle will host a yearly gathering for free if you all will present, right? But what that'll do is that'll allow you all to learn from each other, but you have to let other people come and learn from you who aren't there yet. And they were like, all right, deal, right? And that became the Iowa One-to-One Institute, right? So the Iowa One-to-One Institute, our very first year, had 700 people come, even though we only had 15 one-to-one districts. Okay. And next year there was 45 districts.
Wow.
Then the next year, I had 1,300 people, and the next year we had 90 districts, right? And it just kept going like that, 135, 180. I mean, like within like half a decade, we had 230 districts that were one-to-one, all grassroots, nothing, you know, state top down like in Maine, just one district at a time going. And the conference that we created from scratch that was drawing 1,300 people annually was sort of the annual meeting place for that. And I was hopping in my little red Prius and driving around, you know, boots on the ground, 140 Iowa school districts, helping people any way I could. But as you note, right, so now you've got the Chromebooks or the laptops or the iPads or whatever, and you're like, now what? And that's where the protocol came from, is because we kept talking about technology for the purpose of what? Technology for the purpose of what? And they were like, well, you know, if you're 4 years into your one-to-one initiative and you're still doing digital worksheets at best, you know, you're probably stuck. And so we pilot tested the protocol items for years in Iowa and elsewhere, and then finally released it to the world at large. And it's been really helpful, I think, because, you know, it's kind of practical and specific. So unlike some of these broader frameworks like TPAC or SAMR, where, you know, you just sort of get put at a vague general level, right, or intersection, the protocol kind of gives you hints about what you should actually change or do differently. And I think that's why it's been so popular, is because, you know, if we're talking about student agency, if you take that bullet item and you move it from teacher to student and you redesign for that one thing instead, well, guess what? All of a sudden you've got some more agency because you designed for it. And so it's been sort of a practical, concrete design tool that's been pretty helpful to folks. So, but it all came at us sort of the same thing that you noted, which is, you know, we've got 2/3 of the state districts in Iowa doing one-to-one. How do we move the conversation forward?
So many follow-ups I want to have on this. So, but the first you mentioned 2 things that I think is really interesting when we talk about leadership and we talk about, you know, the good ideas spreading. One approach is top down. Everybody will do this, and this is the way it's going to happen. And then the approach that you took in Iowa, I'm wondering, I'm going to put you on the spot, if you can kind of name the like research or theory behind how that diffusion of innovation that scales from like small groups to, you know, to really getting that buy-in and that grassroots approach.
Well, yeah, I mean, Iowa is a relatively small state. You know, there's only like 3-4 million people total, I think. It's not like California, for example. Right. So it's a little easier to get things done. You know, I think what I was sort of drawing from and what I was noticing is that people in Iowa are actually pretty well connected. They mostly stay in state. They might move from small town to small town, but, you know, you can be 2 hours away and be talking to somebody like, oh, do you know my cousin in, you know, name the other town? And they're like, yeah, I know that person. So word of mouth spreads pretty informally across education circles there. And you have these regional entities called area education agencies that kind of also help bring districts and schools together. So I think, you know, whatever the research is around sort of connectivism or connectedness, but, you know, I think the other thing that we saw was that, and Rogers talks about this in his diffusion of innovation theory, right, is this idea of trialability, right? Like you need to be able to try stuff and see how it fits into your context. And so, You might not be a one-to-one district yet in your small rural community, but you can drive down the road and see how it's operating in a place that looks an awful lot like you do, right? And they're like 10 minutes away. Right? You just drive down to the next town, and they're, you know, a year ahead of you, and you can see. And so I think, you know, sort of Iowa educators' willingness to share and connect and resource each other, you know, 2/3 of my work in Iowa was just connecting people, right? Like somebody would say, do you know somebody who's doing whatever, right? And go like, yes, go see these 3 districts in these 3 other places, right? And that worked great, right? Because you know, there's no way you can resource 300 something school districts, you know, from a central location. You have to have them support each other. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the beauty of your approach and how I see a lot of change happen. It's not necessarily like, I have all the information, let me come to you and bestow this information on you, but you've made resources publicly available. You've created spaces for people to connect. You've allowed them to opt in, see what's possible, and get excited about something. But then to your piece, that see it, right? Like, oh, I can go see somebody else. That's one of my favorite things to do, is bring people to schools. This is, you know, it's not my work, but I'm saying, like, let's come and see it. Let me connect you. Let me see what other people are doing. And that connectivity is so powerful, because then people start to see, oh, I could do that. If you're doing that, I had that in my head, or I was wondering about it, but now that I see it actually happening, I know that it's possible.
Yeah, and also help them unpack that, right? Because, you know, they're coming at it with different eyes than you are. So sometimes when you're doing those school visits, it helps to, you know, be like, so did you notice this? Or ask a question like, you know, I wonder what was happening in that classroom, you know, and sort of that sort of guided inquiry that helps people maybe see some layers that they weren't seeing before, I think is also a great part of that process.
Absolutely. And it's so different than, I'm going to walk in and tell you what you're doing wrong, right? It's the mindset around what's going well, what can we grow, instead of, you're not doing it well enough, you should be doing this, and why aren't you doing that? That space creates an opportunity for people to be much more generative and like, oh, I'm curious, I want to try these things,
right?
Which has been a beautiful thing. So I'm wondering, when you work with leaders in your program, how are you helping them understand these practices, whether it's the 4 shifts protocol or thinking about making their work visible? What's the work happening in Castle that we can learn from?
Yeah, so I'm in a new state,
okay.
And a new university. And of course, you move into existing structures. Colorado is a harder place to get traction than Iowa, I think mostly because it has these really large districts with really entrenched bureaucracies and hierarchies. And also the political angle around ed reform is much stronger here than it was in little Iowa. You know, all the national folks want to get their hooks into big districts like Denver and so on, right? So that makes the dynamic very different. So far, what I've been able to do is that we've completely revamped our principal licensure program to be much more sort of a hands-on, applied program that really focuses on the day-to-day work of being an administrator. And then in the cohorts that I run, of course, I'm squeezing in as much innovation and school transformation and redesign, instructional redesign stuff as possible. So, you know, we redesign lessons together in the program, and, you know, talk about what's the purpose of school these days, and, you know, how do we rethink your horribly boring professional learning, you know, all the things, right? And so just trying to infect, you know, sort of future school leaders as they go out. I don't teach in the superintendent program, so I don't get much intersection with those folks. But I'm slowly starting to build traction with some Colorado districts, right? Starting to get the word out, you know, building relationships with our state administrators association like I had in Iowa and so on. So, you know, it's always a journey. You know, pandemic, of course, has slowed things down a little bit, but we're getting some good traction. And since the pandemic, of course, has basically forced everybody to get computers for kids, I'm hoping that we can start turning that conversation in Colorado like we did in Iowa, and be like, all right, great, you got the tools, now what?
Right. So that's a great segue into this. We were talking about this before we started, is the technology is great, right? We have the technology. A lot of people are finally realizing, okay, technology in schools matters. But sometimes we have seen the constructivist pedagogies or methods be on one side or one camp, that deeper learning. And then we see the technology, you know, apps and devices, hardware, digital worksheets kind of live in another side. And your work, I think, aligns nicely with the work learner-centered practices, where we see these coming together. The future of education, when we think about the purpose of school, really intertwining the technology to support more authentic learning, more student agency, more personalization, that competency-based approach to learning. And so when you see this, I'm curious, what examples are you seeing? I know you just wrote this awesome book. You know, I had a chance, Leadership for Deeper Learning. And you really talk about using technology for new and better purposes in our education system. And I would love for you to talk about, what are you seeing? What are some examples that you highlighted in the book, or that you're particularly inspired by?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And thanks for being a reviewer.
My pleasure. I loved it.
That book. You know, I think Chris Lehman, the principal of Science Leadership Academy, said it best a really long time ago when he said that technology should be ubiquitous, necessary, and invisible. And so, you know, I think the challenge that most schools run into is that they're still thinking about technology as a thing in and of itself, rather than as a means to an end, or their end is still pretty traditional, right? So it's like, yes, it's not about technology, it's about the kind of learning that we're trying to foster, but their vision around learning hasn't changed much from the last few decades, right? So, you know, if your vision of learning doesn't change and you're still focused primarily on lower level learning, factual recall and procedural regurgitation, then you're going to use technology for that, right? Which is why we see a lot of sort of self-paced adaptive learning software systems that are aligned with competency-based progressions, but ultimately it's still low-level learning, right? That's why we see a lot of digital worksheets or, you know, technology usage in the classroom that's very replicative. It's because we don't have a larger vision of learning other than the lower ends of Bloom's or Webb's. And so a lot of my work is just asking people questions like, what do you want your kids to be when they leave you? Right? What are those other competencies besides low-level content, and how do you make those happen, right? And that's always, as you know, a tricky dialogue, because they're either afraid to move that direction, it feels weird or scary, they're getting conflicting messages from policymakers around learning loss and standardized testing and whatever, right? And so a lot of that hand-holding is part of the process.
Yeah, but I want to push on that, because so I'm curious what you're hearing when I'm asking people these questions out in the field. What do you want for your students? What do you want for your kids as parents? I often hear more similarities than differences. So I'm wondering, what are you hearing when you're asking people what their vision for school is, or for their students?
Yeah, I hear those things, and then it's always followed by a but. But we have these tests that we have to get our kids to pass. But we have these curriculum standards that we have to cover, right? Like, this is where, you know, and a lot of that, I think, is stand-in, not for, you know, so I always try to translate, we can't do that because fill in the blank, as I don't know how to do that, right? And I think, you know, if you can reframe it that way, then you can start helping people realize, guess what? You can accomplish your lower level content testing mandates, whatever, right? While also simultaneously accomplishing these other bigger, you know, outcomes for kids that you want them to have. And let's talk about what that looks like and how you could start making some early progress in that direction and so on, right? But that's the conversation, right? It's turning the but, which is really a we don't know how to, not a we can't, right, into a conversation. But you have to have people who are willing to have the conversation, and some are and some aren't. Some organizations are just not ready to have that chat yet. They're still focused on the tests and the content.
Yeah, and I think this is an important opportunity, like you were saying in Iowa, right, as this space that I am optimistic that I am seeing when I'm in places, and granted, it's not everywhere, but when I'm in districts where leaders want to have these conversations, where they're coming out of the pandemic or seeing, wow, we need to be focusing more than just on a test, more than just on what students don't come with, and really start looking at how to have a more holistic view of the learner and our education system. And I'm seeing more and more people asking about that. And I'm encouraged. And those are the spots. Think of it as Iowa, as the country, the world. But I do see that it's possible as we start to bring people in and make those connections around people saying, oh, we can do this. We don't have to be handcuffed by these low-level benchmarks of a standardized test, that we can start engaging in these authentic projects. We can use technology to connect kids beyond the classroom, and ultimately help them navigate their path, which is what we all want, right? We don't want to hold them hostage for 12 years and then say, okay, go fly, without actually having tried to do some things without our support and guidance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm old, you can tell by the gray hair. I've been at this I've been at this a long time. And I feel very hopeful too, Katie, because every year there's more schools moving this direction, or more schools starting to have the conversation. The number of schools that were having this kind of discussion back in 2005 wasn't very many, right? And in 2010, it was a few more. And in 2015, oh, look, the snowball is starting to get bigger. And in 2022, wow, like starting to get some critical mass here. And then we're not there yet. We got 100,000 schools in America alone that we still got to get moving. But lots more than there were before, right? And lots more sort of examples and models and use cases, and a wide variety that you can go see what makes sense to you. And that was really the purpose of the book, right? Was to try and sort of explain, like, this deeper learning work takes all different kinds of shapes and forms and strategies and models, right? Like, go figure out what works for you in your context, but do something.
Absolutely. So tell me about some of your favorite models. What are some of the schools or models that you think are really inspiring or possible? Not even possible, happening.
Yeah. So I'm pretty radical. Like, I'm ready to blow up.
Let's hear it.
School as we know it tomorrow, metaphorically, not literally. So I tend to gravitate towards the schools that give kids almost complete autonomy over their learning, like, all the time. So I think about places like One Stone in Boise, Idaho, where kids basically run the place. I think about schools like Altafiti in Christchurch, New Zealand, where, starting in like 4th grade, kids basically decide what they want to learn for the entire school year. Right.
So I haven't been there. That's on my list to go to New Zealand. Also to One Stone. Those are two that are definitely on my list. So let's start with One Stone. If you say the kids run the place, like, walk me through, what does a day or a week really look like for students at One Stone?
Yeah, so One Stone started as an after-school program, and then parents loved it so much that they were like, can we just do this all day? And so everything at One Stone is centered around student agency, right? So students are working on inquiry projects all the time that they devise. It might be individually, it might be small group. It's much more sort of a studio model. The teachers are sort of, guides on the side, asking questions, connecting kids to resources. But the level of student ownership there is really high. Like, students are on the board, they make financial decisions, they make hiring decisions, like, they make governance decisions. Like, when One Stone says we're putting the student at the center of the experience, they really, really actually mean it, not just in these tokenistic ways. So you never know what you're going to see when you get there, right? Because kids are out and about, they're interacting with community partners on real world projects, they're hunkered down for a couple weeks in-house, diving deep, doing research on something they want to know more about. Like, it's this wide variety of learning experience, but ultimately it's the student driving everything. So it's pretty great.
I love that. So then people will say, well, great, but I still have to focus on a test. How do the kids do? What are these learners who have all this agency and motivation? Right. How are they faring once they leave high school or doing on their tests?
Right. And of course they do great, because they're teachers and problem solvers, right? And we have lots of research that backs that up, that these deeper learning experiences, actually these kids do just fine out in the real world. They do equally well on the standardized tests as their more traditional school counterparts, and they have a whole host of other outcomes, the biggest of which is probably they just have incredibly high levels of self-efficacy, right? So, the reason they graduate high school at higher rates, they attend and graduate college at higher rates, is because they know how to problem solve whenever they run into any barriers, because they've been doing that every day in school for, X number of years. As opposed to the just tell me what to do kid, right? Who has been socialized by school to just do whatever adults tell them. And now they're in university or they're out in the world and nobody's telling them what to do and they're lost, right?
And if we go back to what we want for kids, this is the whole thing, right? If we go back to what we want as parents, you're a dad, as parents, as community members, as educators, as administrators, we say, gosh, every mission statement, vision statement in the world, I want lifelong learners. I want joyful, productive global citizens, right? Like you don't find one that says, I want a kid who can sit in a row and follow all the directions. Yet, yes, too many of our experiences, right? This is where it goes back to getting really clear on what we want for learners, then thinking about the experiences. This is 4 shifts, whatever it is we want to use, but think about how, if we want learners to engage, they need to have authentic projects. It needs to be personalized to them. It needs to be competency-based, and it needs to be in a, an inclusive community where they feel like they belong. All these things that we know matter, we're not matching up with how we're engaging in the practice. So the other part of your book that I really appreciate is, I think we've talked about the learning experiences, and lots of people can say, I want my teachers to do that. Can you go fix my teachers because they're not doing what I want them to do? And I'm not picking on leaders, right? There's always pointing fingers. But what I think you do really well is talk about the conditions. How do leaders set up the conditions that really support teachers to shift practices to get to those outcomes? So you talk about a lot of things in the setting a vision, right? Setting a vision, building capacity, creating learning organizations, connecting with partners. Each of those are chapters, so there's a lot to unpack there. But what are the leadership models that you've seen that are really supporting these practices? And like, how are leaders interacting to actually create those conditions? Because a lot of people are just really don't know how to do it.
Right. So, I think, Katie, going back to what you just said, I think ultimately the biggest problem that we have in school is that kids are really struggling to find meaning in their day-to-day learning experiences, particularly as they go up the grades, right? So, the research is really clear that the boredom and apathy and disconnection with the learning piece of school, not the social piece,
right,
just, gets worse and worse as you move up through middle and high school. But that's a design problem, right? Like it's a design problem. Like, how do we design for higher levels of engagement where we also, cover whatever mandatory curriculum content, whatever we need to hit for the state, but ultimately help kids find meaning and find pathways, in their life that they can lean into for, future success. And so, my work over the last, 10 years or so has really been sort of focused on sort of that design aspect of it, is that how do we lean into the redesign and really articulate what some of those concrete pieces are that go into this. So, the last book, Harnessing Tech for Deeper Learning with the 4 Shifts Protocol, was really sort of an unpacking of their design piece from the instructional side, right? So teachers, coaches, whatever. And thank you for highlighting that in this podcast. I appreciate that.
Of course.
The new book, Leadership for Deeper Learning, was really doing the same thing on the leadership side, right? What are those key leadership behaviors and support structures that enable this kind of learning and teaching that we want to see? And I think ultimately what we found is, just like deeper learning is deeper than traditional learning, is that deeper leadership is deeper than traditional leadership. So, you mentioned things like a vision. in many, if not most schools, that vision and mission statement is something that, was sort of an empty process. It's empty words, it's empty rhetoric. It looks nice on a poster, but ultimately it's sitting on some dusty binder on the shelf. So it's not driving day-to-day action. And what we see in these deeper learning schools is that everything is centered around the mission and vision of what, and the learner profile of what we want these kids to be and how we want the school to operate. And so it's not that, if you're lucky, one or two teachers could articulate what the vision of the school is or the mission statement. Everybody knows what it is. Every kid, every family, every educator, because it's driving the work on a daily basis. That's the difference, right?
Yeah.
And we just see that in every sort of aspect of leadership. Your traditional principal says, oh yeah, I empower my teachers and I delegate to them, and we have a few committees where they have some say. And oh my God, you go to these deeper learning schools and these teachers are like doing everything. They have like complete autonomy or almost complete autonomy, right? And
because they know the vision, right? They know the vision, and they can. They're in service of it.
Right. And the level of trust are just much deeper and richer and robust. And so it's not even that these schools are doing things that are necessarily different, right? Both schools have a vision statement. Both schools say that they empower teachers, but the way they do it and the depth in which they do it is just so much more robust in these deeper learning schools. And that's what we were trying to bring out in that book, is what it can look like instead, right?
Right. And I appreciate that, because as a parent, I have felt that I see it, right? And I see it all the time. We use the same words in education all the time. We say, oh, look at this is personalized learning. But when you go in and see it, it translates much differently across different buildings. And that's when people don't get out of their system, they don't see something else. They only know what's in their mind and their experience. So just like you said, they're like, oh, we empower our teachers, right? I let them have this small little choice, or they run a committee that may or may not really influence the direction of the school. Is totally different than teachers who really feel like they are in charge of making decisions. They have autonomy in their classroom. When a student needs something, that they can make those decisions. And that makes a huge difference when you feel like that's the efficacy you were talking about, right? That like, oh, I know what I'm doing. I have the opportunity to make decisions to impact my students and their learning experiences. And then ultimately that translates to students themselves.
Right. Yeah. And so it's just a different level of ownership. And like you said, when we start moving through the adults into the student body and also doing that with them, then the places really start humming, right? And those are places that you walk away from saying, I wish my kid went there.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that we all want that. And knowing this, you said this also, like same four walls, same standards, right? I see so many schools that they're like, oh, I can't do it because it's the same system generally that's been designed 100+ years ago that we're all operating from. And some people have been able to see it differently and operate because of trust, connectedness, different vision, and ultimately that community who really wants to work together to create something different. And those are the ones that we go, oh yeah, I want to do that. I always say that when I go visit schools, no principal or superintendent ever takes me to a classroom to say, look how well this teacher is following directions. Look at how they're following the pacing guide. Do you see how they're doing exactly the same thing? That never happens, right? But in our minds of like what the perfect teacher is supposed to be or what the perfect school is supposed to be, people think that that's what we're looking for, but that's never what's highlighted or supported. So my hope is that we shift our thinking to, oh yeah, this is what we can do. These are the practices we should be highlighting, not the ones that are in our memories of the past.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we want to see kids lit up. We want to see kids on fire. We want to see kids excited and engaged about what they're doing, not sitting slumped or slouched, as passive recipients of whatever curriculum we're trying to shove into their brains that they're not interested in, right? Like it's a whole different level of energy and enthusiasm. So, and I think we should be fighting for kids every chance we get.
I couldn't agree more. So with that, I'm going to shift us to the rapid fire to wrap us up. There's so many more things we could dive into, but I'm really just really happy to hear your perspective on leadership and the conditions and some of those examples. So I have a few rapid fire questions. What is one thing that we should stop doing in education?
We should stop pretending that all kids need to know the same thing.
Oh, so good. What's one thing we should start doing?
We should start handing over as much power over their own learning as possible to our students.
Yes, yes, yes. What should we keep doing?
We should keep leaning into each other. I found over and over again that there's incredible talent and energy in our own staff if we're willing to set up the conditions that unlock it.
Love it. So you always have new projects. You have a lot going on. You've written a ton. What are you focusing on learning right now?
Thanks. We've got 3 new book projects in the works. One is, what does deeper learning look like in international and independent schools? Because they're a little different ballgame. Mm-hmm. So trying to see what that looks like. Second project is I'm trying to really sort of unpack what some of these structures are that enable deeper learning. So that if your school is new to a structure like a capstone experience or an inquiry project or standards-based grading, or these different components that people are playing with, that the book can help them sort of understand what those are, maybe have a couple of school examples, some resources to get you started. So that's book project number 2.
Awesome.
It was like sort of a building blocks book. And I'm on sabbatical next spring. I'm going to drive around the country with my wife and my dog, and we're going to go unpack what deeper learning looks like in elementary and middle schools.
Oh my gosh, come to San Diego. Yeah, I can't wait to see you.
For sure, I definitely will. Okay. Most of the conversation has been secondary, and yet we know that our younger kids can do this too. So.
Oh, I can't wait. That's so fun. I know one of the things you love to do is travel, and what a great way to go visit schools and travel all around. So what's one thing that many people don't know about you?
I'm on the quest to be labeled the world's clumsiest human.
How are you doing on that?
Well, I'm doing pretty well, actually. Thanks. Katie, I once fell off the stage and broke my elbow at a national conference I was keynoting.
Wow. Did you finish?
Yeah, I did. Actually.
Of course you did.
The whole time. Yep. Yeah. So yeah.
I love it. I mean, I don't love it, but we'll just get you some bubble wrap as you travel around the country.
Perfect.
Do you have a favorite quote or saying?
The quote from Gary Steger has been resonating with me a lot lately. Less of us, more of them. In other words, give it to the kids, let them drive it. So I'm probably living in that space right now.
Love it. What are you grateful for right now?
All the hardworking educators who on a day-to-day basis in some of the toughest conditions possible continue to lean into ways to support children, and all the families out there who somehow are finding a way to make it through. Really hoping that next year is a little better.
Yeah, same. Last question. What's your hope for the future of education?
Oh, I want school in 10, 15 years to look more like a high-tech high model or a One Stone or an Alta Fiti than these dumb, standards-based, testing-oriented learning loss mandates that we're talking about right now. That's my hope. And so I know you and I will keep fighting for that.
Yeah. Well, with that, that's a wrap. Scott, thank you so much. Always a pleasure talking to you. This was really fun. Grateful for you being here today.
Thank you, Katie. Appreciate it.